Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to introduce the special sense of vision and talk about some of the structures that you find in the eye. When we talk about the special sense of vision, what we're actually detecting in this sense is light waves. So when we're considering the name of the special kind of cells involved in the process of vision, we would classify these as photoreceptor cells. Remember that photoreceptors detect light. So my photoreceptor cells help me with the process of vision. When we look at the things in the world around us, we see a variety of different colors. And what leads to these different colors is different wavelengths of the light that we're looking at. So light that travels in more of a slow pattern, these large waves, is more on the red-orange end of the spectrum, whereas light that travels in waves that are much more quick or much smaller are more in the violet-indigo spectrum. Fun fact, when glasses talk about being blue light blockers or purple light blockers, there is actually some science behind that. Back in the day, when we all lived in caves and didn't have smartphones, the only time we would see light that was this wavelength that traveled this quickly was when the sun was out. So when your eyes see light that travels this quickly, your eyes think, oh, it's time to be awake. Even if it's 11:30 at night and you just happen to be scrolling through your Facebook feed. So blue light, purple light, these are higher energy lights, whereas things like red and orange, a little bit lower energy, but really color all comes down to the wavelength of the light photons that are traveling. We have different kinds of cells in the eyeball that detect different colors of light. We'll go through and talk about the integration or the adding together of what we detect with the retina in a moment. Something to keep in mind when we talk about the process of vision, that is about 70% of all of the sensory receptors in your entire body are found in your retina. Take a moment to think about that. The size of your eyeball is not very big compared to the size of the rest of your body, but 70% of the sensory information that you take in is involved in the process of vision. This lets us know that vision is very important because in addition to having 70% of all the receptors, about half of your brain is involved in processing this information. So vision is a very complex type of sense, but it's also one of the most important special senses that we have in humans. This is a special sense that's directly involved in keeping us alive. So as we consider this process of vision, keep in mind that this is a very specialized sensation that we do. When we talk about the process of vision, we have two kinds of structures that are involved. The first kind of structure is what we call accessory structures. Now, the accessory structures are things that are found on the outside of the eyeball. These structures don't directly help us with the process of vision. So let's talk about some of these accessory structures. Some of the first accessory structures that we see are things like the eyebrows or the eyelashes and the eyelids as well. These three external structures, these three accessory structures, are involved in protecting the eyeball, making sure that things don't fall from the air into your eyes, making sure that skin cells don't get into your eyes. All three of those accessory structures protect the eyeball from things getting inside. We also have several accessory structures that are involved in what we call the lacrimal apparatus. So the lacrimal apparatus is the series of structures that are involved in making lacrimal fluid, which is a fancy name for tears, spreading those tears across your eyeball to keep your eyeball moisturized, and then ultimately draining those tears out your nose. This is why when you cry, inevitably you're going to get a runny nose, because those extra tears that you're making on the eyeball have to drain somewhere. They drain into the nose. The final kind of accessory structures that we see on the eyeball are what we call the extrinsic eyeball muscles. The extrinsic eyeball muscles are all found on the very outside of the eyeball. And these muscles have names that help us know what they look like and where they're found. So we have some muscles that are called the superior rectus and the superior oblique muscles. These two muscles are found on the upper side of the eyeball. The superior rectus muscle is the muscle that goes back in a straight line. It's parallel to the optic nerve. The superior oblique muscle travels at an angle. It's oblique compared to that optic nerve. Notice that we also have a lateral rectus muscle. The lateral rectus muscle, again, parallel to the optic nerve. That's what rectus means. And lateral means on the outside. There's also an inferior rectus and an inferior oblique. All of these extrinsic eyeball muscles help us with moving the eyeball. And here's a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge reminder for us. Several of the cranial nerves that we learned about in chapter 13 are involved in eyeball movement. That includes cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve number 4 controls the superior oblique muscle. Cranial nerve number 6. Cranial nerve number 6, the abducens nerve, controls the lateral rectus muscle. All of these other muscles that we see here are regulated by cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve. So let's summarize what we just said. The eyeball has structures called accessory structures. These are not directly involved in vision, but I need them to either protect my eyeball, as we saw with these 3 structures, moisturize my eyeball, as we saw with these structures, or help my eyeball to move, as we saw with these structures. But you should never, ever, ever tell me that an accessory structure helps you to see light. That is simply not its job. The structures that do help me see light are inside the eyeball itself. So when we look at a cross section of the eyeball, we see 3 different layers that are present, each with their own structures inside. So we're going to work our way from the outside, the most superficial, to the inside, the most deep. The first layer that we see on your eyeball is what's called the fibrous tunic. And the fibrous tunic gets its name because it has a lot of collagen fibers that are present, making this layer very thick and very strong. The fibrous tunic has 2 parts to it. The first part is called the sclera. The sclera is the white part of your eyeball. So the white part of your eyeball is seen from the front when you look in the mirror, but it also extends all the way to the very back side of the eyeball and wraps around it completely. So the first part of the fibrous tunic, that's sclera, the white connective tissue. The second part of the fibrous tunic is an area in the front of the eyeball called the cornea. The cornea is the clear part of the fibrous tunic. Light passes straight through this to get into the eyeball. So the cornea is an example of a visual structure because this is a structure that bends the light waves to get them into the eyeball. So the outermost layer of your eyeball, the fibrous tunic, it's either white if we're talking about the sclera, or it's clear if we're talking about the cornea. The next layer of the eyeball is called the vascular tunic. And when we use this word vascular, this means blood vessels. So the vascular tunic layer of the eyeball has blood vessels and a few other important structures. So let's start with that blood supply itself. The blood supply itself, this red layer that I see all along the inside of the sclera, this is a layer called the choroid. Now, if you remember in the brain, we had the choroid plexuses. These were leaky blood vessels that created cerebrospinal fluid for us. When we talk about the choroid layer of the eyeball, this is made entirely of blood vessels. So we're again seeing a type of blood supply this time inside the eyeball. When we look at the front of the vascular tunic though, that middle layer, we also see some structures here and here called the ciliary body, or sometimes they're called the ciliary muscles. The job of the ciliary body is to change the shape of your lens. And the lens is this big structure that we see here. The job of the lens is going to be to focus light onto the retina where we can see it. We'll talk about in our next video how I change the shape of the lens. But for now, what we need to know is that these sets of muscles, the ciliary body, are responsible for pulling on the lens to make it long and lean or short and stout. The other structure that's part of the vascular tunic of the eyeball is the colored part of your eye, and we can see it a little bit in our image here, but the iris, that colored part of the eye, is the third part of the vascular tunic. In the very middle of the colored part of your eye, you have an opening called the pupil. I want you to underline, highlight, star pupil, and I want you to write underneath it that this is an opening, or this is a hole. I can never ask you to identify what structure is here because there's not a structure here. The pupil is just that opening that you see in the middle of the colored part of your eye, the opening that we see in the middle of the iris. So far we've talked about the fibrous tunic on the outside of our eyeball, and we've talked about the vascular tunic that's more toward the middle of the eyeball. Now we're going to go to our final tunic, or our final layer of the eyeball, and this is called the neural tunic. The neural tunic is where I actually perceive light waves. So the neural tunic is made up of a structure called the retina. And the retina has two kinds of cells in it. It has cells called rods and cells called cones. We're going to talk all about how these types of cells are different from one another. But what we want to know right now is that both of these types of cells are found in the retina. That's this yellow layer that we see lining the very middle of our eyeball. In the retina, there's a particular place called the fovea centralis. I want you to underline, highlight, star, fovea centralis. This is a region in the retina, this little indentation here. This is where you see things the most sharply, because this is directly behind that pupil where light gets focused, and we also have a lot of cone cells that live here. So the fovea centralis, where I see the most clearly, which is part of my retina, the neural tunic, or the seeing layer of the eyeball. Right next door to that highest visual acuity area, we also have a structure that I'll mention here called the optic disc. The optic disc is a part of your eye where you actually don't see anything. This is because it's where blood vessels come into or out of the eyeball. You don't actually see this optic disc blind spot in your vision. Your brain is really good at filling in the holes. But this is the whole idea when you're driving. You have to check your blind spot for something you wouldn't normally be able to see. It's the same idea with your vision. We can't see anything right here, but the brain will fill in that gap with the information that it has. The one other thing we're going to look at in the structure of the eyeball is the types of fluids that we find in the eye. So the eyeball interior is divided into two different fluid-filled cavities. These two cavities have different fluids in them that have different chemical compositions and different purposes. So the anterior cavity, the first fluid-filled space, is something that we find in front of the lens. So this area toward the anterior, to the front of your eye, called the anterior cavity. Everything behind that lens is known as the posterior cavity. There are different kinds of fluid in these two cavities. The anterior cavity has what's called aqueous humor. Aqueous humor is watery. So aqueous means it's like water. This very watery or loose fluid is constantly being replaced in your eye In fact, in the course of one of our regular lecture classes together, we've almost completely replaced all of our aqueous humor. So we constantly build aqueous humor and constantly trade it out to keep the lens lubricated, to keep the cornea happy, all of those things. We have a small opening because we're constantly making fluid to allow that fluid to leave, and that's this small structure over here called the canal of Schlemm. So where that aqueous humor goes when I'm done with it, canal of Schlemm, that allows me to keep building new fluid and draining it. The vitreous humor, however, found in the posterior cavity, this is not a watery fluid. In fact, this fluid is almost like jello. It's a combination of many different proteins as well as some sugars. This vitreous humor has a slightly different job than the aqueous humor. The goal of vitreous humor is to help maintain the pressure in the back part of your eye. So keeping that circular shape of your eyeball, due in a large part to this vitreous humor being a lot thicker, a lot more like jello. So we've talked about all the structures of the eye, from the things on the outside that don't help us see, to all the layers on the inside, some of which do. And we've also talked about those fluids. Make sure we can identify these structures, not only for lecture, but also for lab.